Dzień dobry. Nazywam się Anna Fotyga. Jestem polskim posłem do Parlamentu Europejskiego i w imieniu grupy ECR w Parlamencie Europejskim, ale przede wszystkim swoim własnym, chciałam zaprosić wszystkich Państwa na seminarium, konferencję poświęconą sytuacji w regionie dość odległym od nas. Chcielibyśmy skupić się na sytuacji w Hongkongu i w regionie. Angielski tytuł tego jest Hong Kong and Beyond i on ma bardzo specjalne znaczenie, ponieważ Beyond to jest nazwa bardzo popularnego w Hongkongu zespołu, który towarzyszył, zespołu muzycznego, popowego, który towarzyszył wszystkim protestom w ostatnich latach, poczynając od 2014 roku. Chciałabym, pozwolicie Państwo, że jako moderator tego seminarium, które będzie zawierało prezentacje obecnych tutaj wybitnych ekspertów, specjalistów, działaczy, autorów publikacji książkowych, reportaży medialnych. Będziemy się starali też łączyć zarówno z Tajwanem, jak i z Londynem i wysłuchać prezentacji wybitnych specjalistów, którzy będą mówili o regionie. Pozwólcie Państwo na początku na kilka osobistych uwag. Moje doświadczenie publiczne, w jakimś sensie zawodowe też, rozpoczęło się w dziale zagranicznym Polskiej Solidarności. Jeszcze w 1980 i potem w 1981 roku, kiedy byłam studentką studiującą tu w Trójmieście na handel zagraniczny w Uniwersytecie Gdańskim. I sądzę, że te początki jednak spowodowały, że moje zainteresowanie regionem, również polityką Chin, pozostało bardzo, bardzo ważnym elementem mojej działalności zawodowej. Chciałabym, żeby nie tylko społeczności międzynarodowej, ale również polskim słuchaczom, widzom przybliżyć sytuację, z jaką mamy do czynienia.
Learn more about the situation we are dealing with, the memory of Tiananmen, the massacre on the Tiananmen Square. Perhaps also because it coincided in time with a very important anniversary for us, which was the date of the partially free elections which we had in Poland on the 4th of June 1989. And in my memory, this event is still very much alive in my memory, and this is perhaps also why it has affected me so much, the way in which the communist China took over the rule, how it repressed democratic society, how it were connected to places, times, even and those events connected with memory, even the ones connected with honoring the victims of those events, because the democratic community of Hong Kong has always remembered about the victims of Tiananmen. And for us, it was also obvious that it should be this way. It's a bit of a personal remark, and I apologize, but nevertheless, in my in my public life, it remains a very important thread. After all, it's our personal experiences that shape us the most, and that's I would like. That's why I wanted so much to organize here in Gdańsk, in the cradle of solidarity, the seminar dealing with Hong Kong. So please allow me, also due to the fact that we do have an international group of panelists here, please allow me to moderate this seminar in English. And without further ado, I would like to start with the program of the seminar. I would ask the panelists to keep time discipline, please, and please keep your initial presentations to 10 minutes maximum. I would like the seminar to have a dynamic, lively character. I would like us to have some time for questions and answers. And as the first, I would like to invite as our first panelist Mr. Ray Wong, who is an activist, who's a democratic activist, an activist for Democratic Society of Hong Kong. Unfortunately, he had to leave his beloved city because of repressions that accompanied this brutal taking over of power in Hong Kong by the continental China, especially the repressions which took place after the so-called law dealing with, after the so-called national security law was introduced in Hong Kong.
As our first panelist to Ray Wong, who is the pro-democracy activist now based in Germany after obtaining the international protection there. Ray Wong is the advisor of very important group that was initiated first in the UK, United Kingdom, under the name of Hong Kong Watch, those who expose atrocities imposed by the PRC on democratic society of Hong Kong. Ray Wong created in between, after participation in pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong in 2014, and then during the new lunar year in 2016, he initiated in exile the Hong Kong Diasporic magazine, bringing news to Hong Kong diaspora. Ray, floor is yours.
Thank you to Ms. Fotyga, and thank you to all of you to participate in this event. It's really my honor to be speaking here on Hong Kong, especially now we know that there are many different crises happening over the world. In Poland, Polish people are indirectly experiencing the groundless, brutal Putin's war in Ukraine, and Germany, the whole EU are now facing energy crisis for the upcoming winter. That's why it's particularly moving for me to know that Hong Kong has not been forgotten by the international community. In Ms. Fotyga's introduction, she has already mentioned the national security law. We all know that since the implementation of the law, Hong Kong has been under rapid change. A change that's not Hong Kong people expect, it's not the international community wanted. I think one of the most conspicuous changes of the society reflects on the appointment of the new chief executive, John Lee. We all know that he was so-called elected by a government-vetted electoral committee in May. That so-called elections was basically a one-horse race. He was the only candidate, and I think the fact that there were no other opponents in this so-called elections showcase that Beijing doesn't even bother to keep up a democratic appearance in Hong Kong. And I think for many people, it's not really a surprise that Beijing holds John Lee as the next chief executive, because John Lee has earned a reputation as a hardliner during the 2019 anti-government protest. He was in charge at that time to oversee the violent crackdown on the protests, and also in charge of the persecutions with the national security law. And he has always been hostile towards civil society. I remember in 2019, when I disclosed my asylum case here in Germany to media, Hong Kong media asked John Lee what his opinion on that. He was at that time the chief of the police department, and he said, Germany's decision to grant me asylum is absolutely groundless and imprudent, and the Hong Kong government will go after me by any possible means. And John Lee, as a career police officer, has no power base in the civil servant class, no support base in local tycoon, and also from other sectors of the Hong Kong society, which makes him very reliant on Beijing's power and patronage. So the appointment of John Lee already indicates that the head of Hong Kong government, which is supposed to be enjoying a certain degree of autonomy, basically is fully controlled by Beijing. And after a few months of John Lee appointment, John Lee just gave his maiden policy address last month. And in this policy address, we could see what the Hong Kong government is going to do in accordance with Beijing's plans. And from this policy address, we could expect what we are going to see in the next few years. So now I will highlight some key points that are important and relevant for the future development of Hong Kong. So even before the elections, John Lee has already reiterated many times that the upcoming Hong Kong government will prioritize the domestic legislation of national security law through the Article 23 of the City Basic Law. In 2003, the Hong Kong government at that time has already attempted to propose a national security legislation through the Article 23. And this proposal provoked hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers to the streets, and the government eventually backed down. But now, since the Legislative Council has become nothing but a rubber stamp of the government, it would pass without any resistance. And John Lee was initially proposing to pass this domestic national security legislation this year, but 2 months ago, he suspended to next year. The reason he given is that he wants to conduct more in-depth research to ensure that the national security law would encompass all the key national security domain. For example, cyber security, and to control crowdfunding activities, and also to control the so-called false information. What does it mean to the freedom and civil rights of the people of Hong Kong? In terms of cybersecurity, I think we have a very clear example in China what an authoritarian regime would do to control the internet. We can foresee that firewall may be built in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong people could no longer freely access to any social media. For now, for the time being, the law is not very concrete, but we know that under the Chinese Communist Party, the Hong Kong government and Beijing would not permit Hong Kong people to discuss freely regarding political affairs and international affairs on social media and online platforms. And another worrying issue stated in the policy address given by John Lee last month was the promotion of national education. We have seen the proposal of the national security curriculum in 2012, in which the students were required to cry when they see the rise of Chinese national flag. And in those national education materials, it says that democracy is way worse than the Chinese model, the one-party systems, because democracy would create a lot of chaos, which, people in according to these materials, we could see in the US and in the EU. All these materials are in contradiction to the values and the beliefs of Hong Kong people. And so we could expect that through the administrations of the John Lee, Hong Kong in the next few years will become more like another Chinese city where citizens have no political rights, have no political freedom. Children, students will have to go through indoctrination in the education system. And I note my time is almost running out. I have only the last point to make. And in terms of the whole geopolitical environment, I think we should reconsider the position of Hong Kong in the whole geopolitical context after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority, so equivalent to the central bank in a sovereign country, has claimed that they are preparing an emergency plans for similar situations where China or Hong Kong would be sanctioned by the US financially. And 2 months ago, we have seen that the Hong Kong government refused to enact sanctions imposed by the US government on Russian oligarchs, and they refused to seize Russian yachts docked in Hong Kong. So during the Cold War time, Hong Kong has always been a backdoor for China to import goods that were restricted by the West to get into China. But at that time, Hong Kong was under the administration of the British colonial government. But now Hong Kong is in the hands of the authoritarian regime. And we could already tell that Beijing would definitely make use of the special status of Hong Kong for its own interests. Now everyone is talking about a potential invasion in Taiwan. No one has the crystal balls to tell when or whether China would really militarily invade Taiwan. But I think the international community should prepare for such scenario and to review the status of Hong Kong. What if the international community at that moment, if China really invade Taiwan, will have to impose financial, economic sanctions on China, whether Hong Kong would become the backdoor of China to circumvent all these sanctions? I think this is a very important question that now everyone should think about and to prepare for this scenario. I think my time has run up, and I'm very looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wang. We'll have second round, but now, without much ado, I would like to give the floor to Benedict Rogers, who is really instrumental in bringing to the collective West knowledge about situation in Hong Kong. He is a co-founder and now executive chair of the Hong Kong Watch, UK Hong Kong Watch, and actually just following his initiative, similar Hong Kong Watch organizations emerged all over the world, including in the European Parliament, having quite good record already. Benedict Rogers is also deputy chair of the Conservative Human Rights Commission. British Conservatives are our sister party. We used to found the ECR together. It's over 10 years ago now, since that time. He is frequent speaker in both UK, British Parliament, in the European Parliament, in Japanese Parliament, in hearings, in the US Congress, and contributor to international media, not to speak about documentaries and books of his authorship. Ben, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, I think, in your time zone. Good morning from Montreal in Canada, where I happen to be at the moment. And I'm extremely sorry that I couldn't join you in person in Poland. Poland is a country that I have always deeply admired because of your history, your own fight for freedom, which has always inspired me. And I've always wanted to go to Poland. So when I received the invitation, initially I was very excited, and then I realized it clashed with my already pre-planned visit to Canada. But I'm glad to join you virtually. And I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to join this meeting initiated by Anna Fotyga. I'd like to pay tribute to Anna Fotyga for your tireless and consistent and constant support for Hong Kong in the European Parliament. We deeply appreciate everything that you do. It's a privilege also to follow my good friend Ray Wong, who has set out very articulately the situation, particularly under John Lee. And I wanted to start, and I think this builds on what Ray has been saying, by saying that Hong Kong has gone from being one of Asia's most open cities. Indeed, its advertising motto is Asia's World City, to being one of its most repressive police states within just a few years. And that is epitomized, I think, as Ray has already set out, by the choice of John Lee as chief executive, because John Lee spent his entire career before becoming chief executive in policing and security. He was a frontline police officer and then an official in the security department and then the secretary for security. And basically, he has no experience of government other than the experience of locking people up, the experience of security and policing. And I think that symbolizes the police state that Hong Kong is today. I'd like to take a step back initially, just briefly, by saying that even before the implementation of the very draconian national security law in July 2020, Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy were being rapidly eroded and dismantled. Way back, and this is almost insignificant by comparison with what's happened more recently, but way back in October 2017, I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing. I was probably the first foreigner to experience this, although there have been quite a number since my case. More importantly, in those years, pro-democracy legislators were disqualified for simply quoting Mahatma Gandhi when they took their oaths. Joshua Wong, Alex Chow, and Nathan Law became probably Hong Kong's first political prisoners in August 2017. And we saw the abduction of booksellers, and we saw, of course, Ray's own case and other cases in those early years. But the national security law has been the real turning point, the instrument that has completely dismantled whatever was left of Hong Kong's freedoms. It has destroyed press freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and civil society is almost completely shut down. More than 60 civil society groups closed. And I believe that the next freedom that will be targeted and is already in subtle ways being targeted is freedom of religion or belief. And in a sense, that's perhaps inevitable, firstly, because when freedom itself is destroyed, freedom of religion or belief, which is a part of freedom, is going to be affected. But also, of course, the Chinese Communist Party hates religion and persecutes all religions in mainland China, and is already showing signs of restricting and repressing religion in Hong Kong. Not so much freedom of worship. At the moment, it is possible still to go to places of worship openly, but in more subtle ways, the censorship of, or the self-censorship of sermons and other forms of pressure. The pro-Beijing media has already been used to publish articles calling for more restrictions on religion. So I think that is something that should be monitored in the time ahead. I mentioned the dismantling of press freedom, and I think this is perhaps most chilling. Earlier this year, Hong Kong Watch published a report called In the Firing Line, the crackdown on media freedom. And we detail the cases of the forced closure of the pro-democracy independent newspaper Apple Daily, as well as Stand News, Citizen News, and other independent outlets, and the censorship in the public broadcaster Radio Television Hong Kong, RTHK, which used to be the Hong Kong equivalent of the BBC. And I'm not claiming the BBC is perfect, but the BBC at least does have a reputation for being a genuine independent public broadcaster, as did RTHK until the last couple of years. And all of this leaves Hong Kong with almost no independent media. But it is not only the repression within Hong Kong that should concern us, but the impact well beyond its borders. I'll just share two brief examples most recently. The first is that in March this year, I woke up one morning and opened my emails to find, firstly, a letter from the Hong Kong police force followed a few hours later by a letter from the Hong Kong National Security Bureau, informing me that Hong Kong Watch and myself personally are what they described as a serious threat to China's national security, that we are in serious violation of Hong Kong's national security law. Even though we are an entirely UK-based organization with some of our team based in Europe and in Canada, but no presence in Hong Kong at all. We don't have any legal entity in Hong Kong. We don't have any staff in Hong Kong. We don't have any presence in Hong Kong. And yet Hong Kong's national security law has this extraterritoriality clause that means that it can reach out well beyond its borders to claim that people acting outside Hong Kong are in violation of that law. And so these letters told me to cease our activities within 72 hours of receipt of the letters. And they said that failure to do so could result in me personally facing a prison sentence of, the first letter said 1 to 3 years. The second letter said 3 years to life, which is quite a broad spectrum. And of course, there's nothing really that they can do to enforce these threats, other than obviously the countries that have extradition agreements. And so I do have to be mindful of that when I travel, although I very much welcome the recent announcement by the European Court of Justice that calling on European countries to cease extradition agreements and not to extradite anybody to China. And I assume that includes Hong Kong, although I hope that will be confirmed and clarified. With our case, it became public. It was released by the BBC and the Times. Our Foreign Secretary at the time, Liz Truss, made a very strong statement in support of us. And I think we were the first foreign NGO to be threatened in this way, but I'm sure we won't be the last. And I think it's a warning for all of us. Needless to say, we ignored the request to cease our activities, and we continue. Indeed, it made us redouble our efforts. The second incident I want to mention is the recent incident some of you may be aware of in the Chinese consulate in Manchester, where on the opening day of the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress in Beijing, a group of Hong Kongers in Manchester organized a protest outside the consulate, which they often do. And it was a perfectly normal thing to do. It was a totally peaceful protest, and they had every right to do so. But on this occasion, the Chinese Consul General himself, together with several of his consulate staff, came out of the gates of the consulate, started tearing down the posters and placards and banners of the protesters, and then physically assaulted several of the protesters on the street outside the consulate in Manchester. And then the worst moment was when they dragged one young Hong Kong man, Bob Chan, through the gates of the consulate so that he was on consulate ground, where they continued to beat him. And the Consul General himself pulled Bob Chan's hair very, very severely, whilst two of his colleagues literally stuck their fingers in Bob Chan's eyes, a very gruesome attack. And it was only because the British police decided to intervene and pull Bob Chan back through the gates out of the consulate. And Bob Chan told me himself personally that he believed if the police had not intervened, he feared for his life. The Consul General himself admitted to doing this. He gave an interview a few days later on television where he said that he had pulled Bob Chan's hair and that, in his words, it was his duty. He actually used that word, duty, to do so because the Hong Kong protesters were insulting Xi Jinping. And this is an appalling incident because no diplomat obviously should behave in this way. And it's a real threat to our own freedoms in Britain and in our democracies. And we're urging the British government to apply a very robust response. Let me just draw towards a conclusion by asking the question, what should we do on all these issues? Well, I'd like to suggest a few ideas. The first is that I hope we can shine a spotlight on the trials of political prisoners, and indeed the cases of political prisoners in Hong Kong's prisons themselves. But there are several upcoming trials that I hope we will monitor and highlight and make sure are not forgotten. First of all, in early December, I think next week, the national security law trial of Jimmy Lai will begin. Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, who's already been in prison for 2 years. He's faced multiple other charges, but he's been in jail awaiting trial for 2 years. His national security law trial will begin, and it's likely that he will receive a very severe sentence, but we should monitor that very closely. There's also the case of the 47 former legislators and activists who were arrested simply for having held a primary election. And their case will come up, I believe, in January. We also saw just last night, or in the early hours of today, that Cardinal Zen, Hong Kong's 90-year-old cardinal, and his colleagues have been convicted in their case. And I don't believe a sentence has been passed yet, but they have been found guilty. And that's a very serious deterioration, that they could be prosecuting and convicting a 90-year-old cardinal simply for having been involved in assisting protesters with their legal fees. So monitoring those trials is the first thing. Secondly, I hope the European Union will join the UK, Canada, and Australia, which have already in various ways offered lifeboat schemes to help Hong Kongers find sanctuary and freedom. Germany has, in the case of Ray, been the first European country to offer such assistance, but I hope the EU as a whole will do its part to offer a lifeline to Hong Kongers who may not qualify for Britain's very generous scheme, but who need a place of sanctuary. Thirdly, I think we should be using targeted sanctions, Magnitsky-style sanctions, to target officials and entities in Hong Kong and Beijing who are responsible for dismantling Hong Kong's freedoms. If they are made to feel no consequences for what they have done, if they're allowed to get away with destroying Hong Kong's freedoms with impunity, then they will just be emboldened to be even more repressive in Hong Kong and emboldened to increase their aggression towards Taiwan and beyond. Thirdly, in 2024 at the United Nations, China faces its Universal Periodic Review, the review that every country goes through every few years at the UN. And I hope that European countries and the EU itself will make sure that Hong Kong is included very prominently in the Universal Periodic Review with some very strong recommendations. I think that we should be looking at what we can do in all our countries to protect our freedoms at home, and both for ourselves and for Hong Kongers, for Uyghurs, for Tibetans, for Chinese dissidents who are in our country, making sure that that our freedoms are protected. And that means shutting down the secret Chinese police stations that have been found in many countries now across the world, and which are totally illegal and unacceptable. We should be shutting down Confucius institutes that act simply as an arm for propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party. And we should be looking at pension funds. Hong Kong Watch just published our third report on ESG, looking at pension funds that are invested in Chinese companies complicit with atrocity crimes in China. We should be putting pressure on our pension funds to divest from those. And we should be diversifying our supply chains and our trading relationships to ensure that we're no longer dependent on China. We should reduce strategic dependency. So in conclusion, I think it's time to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is, as the title of this event says, a threat to the international rules-based order. And Hong Kong illustrates that very clearly. China has seriously breached an international treaty the Sino-British Joint Declaration that was meant to exist for 50 years from the time of the handover of Hong Kong. Halfway through, they're already in serious violation of that treaty. So it's time to act, to end impunity, to provide a lifeline for those who need to escape, and to protect our own freedoms and democracy at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rogers. Please allow me just a few sentences to Polish audience, picking one item. I'm sure that Mr. Piotr Bernardyn is also elaborated on this, namely bring the case of the elderly Cardinal Zen. Actually, his fate reminds me about Polish primate Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński as well, who used to defend his people, his nation against the atrocities of then communist rule in Poland. Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, the persecution of Cardinal Zen he's over 90 years old. He's an authority in the Catholic Church, a person of authority there in Hong Kong. And this is one of the examples that should move us and our consciences. Certainly, we have done it in the European Parliament. During the debates, we did address his situation and the persecution that he's subjected to. Mr. Rogers has talked about him and his colleagues that they have been deemed guilty in recent days, and that is something that is immensely moving, because he has just been following his mission and his calling, and we here in Poland, we are familiar with such situations.
I would like now to give the floor to Anouk lady, very brave lady who is a journalist, researcher, human rights activist, specializing in the region, also very active, instrumental in defending the rights of Uyghurs, and that I share this view as well. Of course, please listen to her.
Hello. Thank you so much, Anna Fotyga, for organizing and inviting us here today. I'm really honored to be here to talk about Hong Kong in the special place of Gdansk. And thank you so much for everyone who came to listen. And thank you for your interest and support for Hong Kong. Today I want to talk about how China is influencing international law through Hong Kong. I think that when we think about the Chinese Communist Party and the disintegration of the international order, it's hard to understand how they do it, and I want to give 3 examples of how the Chinese Communist Party is doing this. The first is how they are manipulating language at the UN. The second is the national security law in Hong Kong. And the third is lawfare in Hong Kong, which is how they change the law so that the law itself can be used to suppress human rights. So firstly, at the UN, China, the Chinese Communist Party, has a very large role and influence. They're a Security Council member. They are one of the biggest donors, and they also have some funds which it directly influence the Secretary General. And in their official position paper on cooperation with the UN, they said that they are pursuing a path of human rights development that suits China's national reality and needs and has the wholehearted support of the Chinese people. So I think we see increasingly that China is using the UN and the language of human rights to tell people that they are pushing for human rights, that they support human rights, but actually they do it in a way that benefits their regime and their values. So for example, in Hong Kong, China has used the right to health and the right to collective security to impose COVID restrictions, but actually these restrictions stop people from protesting because they're no longer allowed to gather together outside. And they do so in a way where there is no assessment of whether the restrictions are necessary or proportionate, and in a way where people are unable to do anything about the restrictions on their right to freedom of assembly and to protest. Maybe even more obviously or more blatantly, this summer, the UN Human Rights Committee issued a report on Hong Kong's implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It was an excellent report. It recommended that Hong Kong repeal the national security law that my colleagues spoke about, and it also raised concerns about the number of civil society organizations that have had to leave Hong Kong since the new law. So these are very excellent recommendations by a very objective group of experts, and Hong Kong's government objected to these findings. They said that the UN Human Rights Committee's criticisms were unfair, and they said that the national security law actually restores the enjoyment of rights and freedoms. And I think this is a very clear example of how the government is manipulating the language in international law in general, but at the UN specifically, where they're able to say, we value rights and we value freedoms, but we do it in our way. And we think certain rights are more important than others. And overall, this is a kind of intellectual way of suppressing human rights, specifically civil and political rights, by saying that other ones are more important, and that they are reinterpreting the rights in a way where people's civil and political rights are actually suppressed. I also want to talk about the national security law that my colleagues addressed. For those of you who don't know so much about it, the national security law was passed actually by China on the 30th of June 2020, and the law criminalizes secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign and external forces, and it has maximum life penalty. And for me, and for a lot of people, this law is really hard to understand. The terms are really vague. They didn't tell us what secession actually means, what terrorism means. They are able to interpret the law in the way that suits them the most. So actually the law is used to suppress civil society in Hong Kong. And even though the government said that the law would only be used to target a small number of individuals, it's actually had a huge impact. Over 150 people have been arrested under the law itself, but even more than that, so many people, because they don't know what the law means, and because they also know that there's a maximum of life in prison, they're afraid of the law. So they delete their information on social media, or they don't talk about things on social media anymore. Events are not happening. And the most remarkable thing is that the Chinese government said that this law has extraterritorial application. So for my colleagues, for my organization, for anyone here, there's also a threat that the Hong Kong national security law means that we're not allowed to talk about certain things, that we're not allowed to do certain things. And this is very clearly a violation of our civil and political rights. And now we see in Hong Kong that the law is being applied to education, to culture. It's much more than just a very targeted law that actually protects national security. And definitely from a personal perspective, as I mentioned, it means that a lot of my friends, my colleagues, we don't know if what we're doing violates the national security law because the law is just so vague, and the government can interpret it in a new way when they want to target a specific individual or a specific event. So It means that people are not doing things anymore, that we're no longer able to talk about politics, that events are not happening, that people don't publish things. And when people do these things, we think that we cannot go back to Hong Kong anymore, even though it's our home, because we don't know if what we did is illegal under the national security law. So even though it's simply a law, its vast application, including extraterritorial and including things that you might not think are national security, means that the ambiguity is having a very large impact and very effective at suppressing civil and political rights in a way which strategically the government says is protecting of other human rights because they said it's a national security law. And then lastly, I want to talk about lawfare in Hong Kong, which sort of follows up on the national security law. And the national security law, I think, is a very clear example of how the government introduced one law under the guise of national security, and the law is used to suppress civil and political rights. But there's a lot of things where the government cannot say it's a national security law, but they would still like to make life difficult for activists and civil society and make political activities not exist in Hong Kong or really tame them. And we see that the government is able to use other laws to suppress civil society. So for example, as my colleague Ben mentioned, there is a trial of the 612 Humanitarian Fund, and the verdict came out today. And this was a humanitarian fund that was established in 2019 to support protesters by giving them financial support, legal support, medical support, psychological support to people who are peacefully protesting in the street. And the government has already made it so that the fund had to dissolve. They made it impossible for the fund to collect donations, basically. So the fund has already dissolved. But in addition to this, the trustees, the 5 trustees of the fund, who include the 90-year-old Cardinal Zen and the secretary of the fund, were accused of not registering the fund correctly within the society's ordinance. And so they've just finished going through a trial on this clause, and they've all been fined. And it's the first time that this law has ever been applied to a civil society organization. And I think it's very obvious that the government is using lots of different laws that exist in our legal system, maybe technical points, to make it very difficult for civil society organizations to exist. Because if you have a civil society organization in Hong Kong, and maybe you're doing something political, you don't know whether the government is going to find some technical reason to make you close down. And even though this is legal, this is another way for the government to suppress civil and political rights in Hong Kong. And I think this is going to be the first of many trials, some on national security and some on other laws, where the civil society and the political environment in Hong Kong is slowly squeezed to the point that it complies with what Beijing wants to do. And this is something that we strongly condemn, and we must keep supporting civil society in Hong Kong that continue to do this work, as well as civil society outside of Hong Kong nowadays, who want to continue to do the work but are unable to do it in Hong Kong because the laws have been rewritten. And then reflecting on the way that the international legal language has changed and the language at the UN has changed, we also have to support activists outside of China who are doing things that are completely legal and excellent in terms of activism and our values, but that China is able to now use new language to question the validity and the legality of this activism. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wer. Let me use this opportunity to welcome to our seminar His Excellency, the Ambassador of Australia to the Republic of Poland. I hope that, Excellency, I hope that immediately after our distinguished panelist, you will grant us also a short statement on Australia's experience and views on Hong Kong, if you wish, naturally. To our panelists and to the rest of the audience, sorry, I like to tell that we host today also members of the Polish association by the name of Dignity, Godność, who are former political prisoners suffering under communist rule in Poland. And I hope to give them the floor and also listen to their short statements. Now, I'm sorry. It is after this week's very busy parliamentary session in Strasbourg. That was quite important from the other point of view. Without much ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Piotr Bernardyn. Pan Piotr Bernardyn jest polskim dziennikarzem, pisarzem, ekspertem.
Mr. Piotr Bernardyn is a Polish author, journalist, expert who is very much engaged in pro-democracy movements, right? He voices his opinions in media, public media, both in Poland and abroad. In Poland, he's most connected with Tygodnik Powszechny weekly. He's an author of well-known publications, also the author of a well-known book, Hong Kong, Say That You Love China, as well as another book, The Sun Has Not Risen Yet. Mr. Bernardyn is a well-respected author, expert on the Far East, on the global politics in the region. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. To start with, I'd like to perhaps refer to what has already been said, because I've heard about Cardinal Zen and Jim Lai, because the only billionaire in Hong Kong, the only billionaire in Hong Kong, there are about 80 of them in Hong Kong, who since the Tiananmen Square events was in opposition to the authorities, and the way he governed, that, you know, the case we have of Cardinal Zen, who was convicted of $4,000 of Hong Kong dollars, which is about 2,000 zlotys, which is not that much, you might say. However, it is symbolic that such a great symbolic figure was convicted. Fine. And by the way, he was arrested. He was apprehended in spring of this year, and he was apprehended by the police, which was responsible for the national security law. So there was a possibility that he would be tried under the national security law legislation. For so far, it's been left aside, but we'll see what will happen next. Well, the verdict has taken place today, so it's worthwhile to mention it. He knows a lot about Poland. He's been to Poland. To him, always an example of the attitude of how a priest, how a man of religion should act on behalf of society is our Cardinal Wyszyński. He's somewhat a little bit in conflict with the Vatican now, with Pope Francis, because I'm not sure if you've heard, but recently Vatican prolonged its agreement with China. We'll see what will happen next. And the second character, Jimmy Lai, a second person, Jimmy Lai, they're somewhat similar because they escaped China, continental China, to Hong Kong when they were young. Cardinal Zen is 90, Jimmy Lai is 74. However, in case of Jimmy Lai, he was a young man who started working in a textile factory. Later, he became very wealthy. And a breaking point in his life was Tiananmen Square. And it was actually then that he converted to Catholicism. He became a Christian. And so there's a connection there, and I'd like to also add that in the case of Jim Lai, he also knows about solidarity, he knows about Poland, so it's a bit of a common ground. However, in case of Jimmy Lai, another important point is that today, as a decision was supposed to be made, whether a British lawyer could be present during his trial. However, the decision was moved to next week. And I can just add, because it's been mentioned a couple of times, I can just say it again, that the most important document that changed everything in Hong Kong is the national security law, where the Chinese authorities left a little back door there, you know, because the legal system does function somewhat differently in Hong Kong still. However, in difficult cases, the authorities say there is a possibility to move the trial to the continental China. And pro-government press in Hong Kong demands this case, the Jim Lai process, to continental China. And of course, that was a trial made for demonstration reasons, but in order, they probably want to do it to scare others simply, to send a strong message. And the case of Cardinal Zen, it's similar. So that's just by the way of introduction. I had mostly dealt with Japan and China. I did write about Hong Kong in the past too. However, 3 years ago, I was asked to write a book, and it was the moment of protest in Hong Kong. I'm sure you all watched those live back then. And back then, I didn't have such detailed knowledge as our guests of the situation in Hong Kong. However, I did feel somewhat as a guest in Hong Kong, because I did fly to Hong Kong during demonstrations in order to experience the situation myself. And even today, it's hard for me to believe that in such a short period of time, in 2-3 years, so much has changed. Because on one hand, it's the same city, right? You have these great skyscrapers. Of course, pandemic had an effect as well, but on the other hand, everything changed, everything ended. In my book, if you are interested, please take a look. I do not glorify the British, because it was not always ideal with them either. However, we take a period, a long-term perspective, perhaps slowly with resistance, but we have to say that there was more freedom under the British. There was more space, so to speak, for democracy. And you might say, you know, Democrats were thinking that after the transition, they will be able to still elect the representatives. That never happened. But what happened in 2020 and 2021, these are 2 years that are important. In fact, that changed everything. And now a turn occurred, a turnaround. There is definitely less and less freedom. It's a backward turn. About legal acts, the first one is the national security law, which is so wide that basically anybody can be convicted if they want, if they don't like the person. The biggest penalty, I think, it's life sentence under that act. And the second act is the change of the voting, of the election structure that was done in September, and the so-called only patriots can hold public office in Hong Kong. And who is a patriot? Well, party decides who a patriot is. So today you have to love China, which means you have to love Communist Party, or support it at least, which automatically, of course, puts out of the picture all the Democrats, all the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. After all, I'm Polish, so I'd like to also give a little bit of Polish background to what happened in Hong Kong. And very often, frankly, you know, researching Hong Kong and writing about Hong Kong, when I saw some problem, some issue, I tried to refer to our Polish reality, try to compare it to what has happened in our history. For example, try to define at what point of history is Hong Kong now. Is it, for example, 1981, like in Poland, when martial law was introduced? Or is it perhaps 1945, when the communists come? One of the first books which I've read while writing my own book was a book by Czesław Miłosz. It was a book entitled, I think, Taking Over Power, not widely known. It's a novel taking in those years right after the war, which shows how, as a result of this wheel of history turning, when it's all known that Poland is going to become communist, how people, how intelligentsia, how the intellectuals try to kind of situate themselves in this new reality, how they explain to themselves what's happening, how they justify it. And I also referred to the situation in Hong Kong, because when you talk about Hong Kong, the limiting of freedom, it's all true. However, we have to remember that Hong Kong is not a monolith. It's not that 100% of Hong Kongers always vote for democracy. It's never like that, and not in any society. The only free elections in Hong Kong are on local level. It's 60-40 usually. So it doesn't mean that within these 40% you have just communists, but perhaps there are people who, I don't know, they didn't want the problems of demonstrations. They wanted to be quiet on the streets and so on. So even today, after 2-3 years of dealing with Hong Kong, I look at this so-called human condition. I look at the elites of Hong Kong and I try to understand their motivation. And we already held about John Lee, the current boss of the Disintegration, but before that was Madame Cadilan for 5 years. And she ruled when the demonstrations were taking place. In a way, she started the processes. She wanted to force the extradition act. And I treat her as a representative of a certain group in Hong Kong. It's a person who is born in Hong Kong. She always says that she came from a modest family, which, thanks to her own hard work, gained a high social position. She had British citizenship until a certain point. Her husband is a British subject. They both studied in great schools. After graduating, she becomes part of colonial administration. And it seems that nothing points to her being pro-communist or pro-Chinese, pro-continental Chinese. And then after 97, a change takes place. She probably was a good employee, so she is promoted. She's selected as the head of administration. And at some point, when she's actually selected as the head of administration, by the way, we have to say that there was a certain dose of hope, of optimism. Even people who are connected with the Democratic camp looked at her candidacy because it's a person from Hong Kong, not connected with financial elites, but a simple way, simple promotion. And what happens? Everything changes. She starts repeating the ideology of the Communist Party, the Beijing ideology, and this is the case until today. And there are many more people like that in Hong Kong. So my reflection is that, well, you know how it is with opinions and what's set in stone and what is not. There are more people like that in my book, whom I present, people who change their ideas and come to the other side of the barriers. So, for example, Carrie Lam, and this applies to today's leader of Hong Kong, and it shows the scale of the lie and what happened to Hong Kong. For example, they think of the Formula One nation to systems is all great, everything is working, and it's only now that the system is okay, despite all those people in prisons and the massive immigration, because they think that nothing has happened in Hong Kong. So this also shows the scale of the whole thing. I can also say that I think after a year of repression, libraries pointed to the fact that books of Orwell became very popular in Hong Kong, which is also a sign of the times. And something I've read in the Hong Kong press, what's left of it, and that today a form of protest, because you can't protest officially, is buying products, for example, vegetables which were grown in Hong Kong. Once a week, some people, or on a permanent basis, they have little plots of land where they try to grow vegetables. And I'm thinking of Kundera's novel here, where the main hero at the end of one of his novels ends up on a farm, because it's this only element which is not permeated by lie, that nature, that earth, that growing vegetables is real, it's true. And I think there are more parallels like that you can look for between today's Hong Kong and the situation in in the communist Eastern Europe in the past. Now, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note completely, although it's not easy to be an optimist in Hong Kong. Sometimes I'm asked this question at meetings: what's going to happen next? So on one hand, China appears to be this huge monolith of the West, in comparison to the West, where democracy is in permanent crisis. But the authoritarian state is also characterized by hiding a lot under this mask, this curtain, and you don't quite know what's happening beneath the surface. Perhaps you've heard about the demonstration in the Foxen factory where the iPhones are produced in the south of China. But something else drew my attention: how strictly China is forcing this COVID-0 policy, this total control. It's like 1 or 2 people are infected, and right away there is quarantine and so on. Especially Shanghai was affected by that in the first half of this year. And an interesting situation took place, because for the first time in China, I think, after reforms, in Shanghai, in those districts where middle class is living, rather wealthy people, certain demonstrations took place, and who demonstrated people who are quite wealthy, who lived in these glass towers, because until now there was some sort of social agreement, right? We allow you to get richer and get wealthy. We do not interfere in your private life, and you don't get into politics. But then it turned out that, when people from the entire apartment building could be sent on a quarantine, people became upset. And despite censorship on internet, you could see that people were Googling up immigration from China very much. So you don't quite know what's going to happen. And from the point of view of those who care about freedom in Hong Kong, in order for something to change Hong Kong, something has to change in China. And despite what the communist rulers would like to say, I think we can still be surprised about what might happen not so far in the future, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating report. Very reliable, like a true journalist, and that's why it has been so interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the next contribution from Poland to today's seminar. This time, we are going to have an online presence. We are going to have a online link with Taiwan, from where we'll hear from Hanna Shen, who is a correspondent in the region for many media outlets in Poland and beyond. Also, the Epoch Times is where she writes too. In Poland, that's mainly Gazeta Polska, the Polish daily, New State, and the Independent Portal, PL. I'll have to admit that I'm partial here, because it's with great pleasure that I listen to the reports from Anna Shen. And I would like to mention one thing as well. When I was starting out on my previous term in the European Parliament back in 2014, I do remember a visit from a representative of Taiwan at the time in Brussels at the European Union, the ambassador of Taiwan. And he spoke at length and in great detail, and a very factual account. He illustrated the situation in Hong Kong and his concern, and the concern among the people of Taiwan, what was happening in Hong Kong at the time. I did my best to follow that situation before that as well, but I have to admit that his view of the situation was very important to me in directing the way I was monitoring the situation later on. Over to you, Hanna Shen. Can you hear us? Yes. Can you hear me now? Once again, welcome everyone. Hello. Welcome from Taiwan. We have evening here, so good afternoon to you all, or good evening even. I'm happy to be with you and participate in this discussion. I'll talk a little bit about Taiwan. But I would also like to refer to what has already been said. It's been mentioned a number of times that the changes that happened in Hong Kong, they took place very rapidly. I remember back in the late 2015 in Taipei, we were watching a movie produced in Hong Kong. Many people from Hong Kong know this movie. It's 10 Years. That's the title, produced in 2015, and it presented a vision of Hong Kong under the rule of the Communist Party in 2025. And it was a frightening vision. We saw protesters in the streets. They were beaten up by the police. We saw the Hong Kong residents who couldn't find work because they wanted to speak Cantonese rather than Mandarin. And we saw a fabricated murder fabricated by the authorities of Hong Kong, and that there was to be a cover-up or a pretext for a very harsh national security law. I was very depressed after seeing this movie, but I had a hope that it's just a depressing vision of an artist. Today we have 2022, and I've got to say that this dystopian vision presented by the people of Hong Kong unfortunately became reality. And to me, this is a warning that, in fact, we don't have much time if we want to counteract what CCP does. And these actions should be aimed at what's the subject of this meeting, that's the disintegration of our system and our values, the destruction of our values. Looking in Taiwan, Taiwan looked at what was happening in Hong Kong, and it was a sobering experience. So they learned about something that we seem to know but often forget. Do not trust the communists. Any promise, any international law that they sign eventually will be broken and infringed. 2 years ago, I had an interview with a remarkable person, Cardinal Joseph Zen. He very often referred to another great person, John Paul II, by saying that this was the Pope who understood communism very well. And Cardinal Zen very often emphasized in that discussion that communism is evil. The breaking of laws and freedoms that happened in Hong Kong, I think that it made the people of Hong Kong aware that this evil is not just affecting people in China and Hong Kong, that these atrocities that happened, genocide, Uyghur genocide, Tibet crimes, the things that happen in Hong Kong, these are not just some separate matters. There is a single thing behind them, a single organization, the CCP, the Communist Party of China. We now have elections in Taiwan. One of the candidates had the slogan, let's contradict the communists, let's protect Taiwan. I liked it a lot, and I thought that we do need such a movement on an international scale to counteract the CCP and what they do. Hong Kong also taught the Taiwanese people that the concept of one state and two systems that was mentioned before is just an illusion. I don't think there's anyone in Taiwan today, and definitely not among young people, who would believe that this concept, that this would work for Taiwan, this principle would work for Taiwan. In 2020, back in the elections in Taiwan, the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, who was running to be re-elected, had this slogan, today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. And She repeated it a number of times in interviews, and I have to say honestly that when I was listening to it, I could not remember the words in 2008 what the Polish President Lech Kaczyński said in Georgia. Today, Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, the day after tomorrow the Baltic states, and later on perhaps my land, Poland. Both Lech Kaczyński and Taiwan, they were speaking to us, and they were right. If we do not face the authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China, these regimes will keep destroying our international order. And we are seeing this today on a daily basis in Ukraine. We can also see how China on a daily basis is destroying our values. Let me talk about something that happened recently in Poland. On Saturday, I'm going to have a premiere of a movie about the Jimmy Lai, Hong Konger, that's the title of the movie. And during the promotion of the movie, one of the managers of Huawei, a Chinese person, a manager who works in Poland, he demanded from the embassy of China that all those who have organized this the screening of this movie in Poland, to be blacklisted, along with everyone else who is going to take part in the discussion after the movie. So that's just one more example how the Chinese are trying to intimidate us, how they are trying to destroy our liberties, including the freedom of speech. And it's not happening in Hong Kong, it's not happening in China, it is happening here in Europe. And the subject of today's meeting, to me, seems to be very topical in terms of Taiwan, a country that I believe to be on the first line of defense of our democratic values. At the 21st of the Congress of the Communist Party that has recently ended, the head of the General Secretary, Xi Jinping, not just consolidated the power in his hands to a degree that would have not been considered even several years ago, but also during that Congress, very harsh words were said about Taiwan. In his address, opening address, Xi Jinping said that the Communist Party will not quit its purpose of reuniting Taiwan with China, with People's Republic of China. And in order to gain this objective, it will not forego resorting to power. And towards the end of the Congress, it was announced that the constitution of the Communist Party, that is more important than the country's constitution, that this party's constitution will now have a statement that the Communist Party, and has been entered for the first time ever to this document, that the Communist Party will be decidedly opposing and preventing an independence of of Taiwan. And so these very harsh references to Taiwan means that the policy of Xi Jinping towards Taiwan will not change. If anything, it will be even more aggressive. And that a military aggression, Chinese military aggression on Taiwan, is not something that is a distant future. So these statements, I believe, are also a confirmation of what we are seeing in Ukraine, Russia's aggression on Ukraine, that authoritarian regimes are prepared to do anything to make their ambitions happen, to make their expansionism happen. And whatever happens around Taiwan, what China is planning to do regarding Taiwan is very important. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy which respects the international order based on law. It's also a very important economy, not just in the Indo-Pacific region. Please remember that almost 90% of high-quality semiconductors and this technology comes from Taiwan. And if China were to take over control on that production, that would mean a disaster for the entire world. Taiwan is also important in terms of the security of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. If China were to take over Taiwan, that would increase a risk, a threat for those countries, and it would also mean that China would have a more firing power in the Pacific. And some researchers believe, and I agree with this, that from the point of view of NATO, Taiwan is also very important. Let's imagine that there is indeed a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Then probably this would mean a conflict between Beijing and Washington. And at that point, NATO could not just stand idly looking. A lack of response from the NATO would mean the end of that pact. So these are just several examples which I hope will make you aware that Taiwan is very important indeed. The steps taken by China towards Taiwan are a threat not just to Taiwan, the people of Taiwan. They go beyond Taiwan. Beyond, this word is very important here. They are a threat to the international order as such. And we are right when we speak about the Russian invasion on Ukraine, that it is a threat to this order. But we can say the same thing about the military operations of China around Taiwan. For example, military exercises that took place during a visit from the head of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, in August this year in Taiwan. China will intensify its tactics of intimidation. They have war games around the island, and they are testing the airspace of Taiwan, and it has never been done so before. Just in August this year, a record-breaking number of 446 Chinese aircraft went inside the Taiwanese airspace, and other steps taken towards Taiwan include cyberspace attacks, economic coercion, and one of the most well-known examples of using economic coercion is what happened with Lithuania, when Lithuania in November this year opened up a Hong Kong representation office. Of course, they got mad. China was mad and wanted to influence Lithuania to change that decision using economic factors and measures as well. It was not just aimed at Lithuania either. They were trying to persuade countries from other companies from other countries which buy products in Lithuania to influence the authorities in Lithuania to change that decision on setting up that office. All these measures, as I said, they relate to Taiwan, but they go beyond Taiwan. And they are an example of using sharp power by the Communist Party of China. And the aim is to sow fear and intimidation so that we start doubting and lose faith in our democratic system, our democratic values, democratic institutions. And when we start doubting our values and our system, then we become a very easy target for authoritarian regimes such as Russia and China. I think that we are going to talk more about what we can do, and we heard about it from the speakers before, what we can do in order to prevent this situation so that the conflict doesn't get even more extensive. But from the perspective of Taiwan, I would like to add that it is very important for democratic countries to exchange their experience with Taiwan. Also to learn from Taiwan how to defend these democratic values. And one of the lessons here that we could have learned a long time ago from Taiwan is interference in elections. China has been interfering with elections since 1996. That's quite a long time. Given that it's only today in the West that we are trying to approach this subject of the Chinese interference into elections. And recent example was Canada, when Chinese interference is described in 2019. As for the exchange, there's good news there. This exchange is more and more extensive. The EU, the US, Canada with Taiwan various fields. Today, when we have discussions, groups of researchers and politicians go to Taiwan in order to observe democracy in action, live democracy in action, so that they can see and watch, observe elections, and these elections are happening tomorrow. It's also very important with Taiwan to allow Taiwan to participate in international organizations and institutions whose task is to defend international order, and which are there also as a forum for us to discuss various issues. And I think that the pandemic has shown us very clearly that if, at the request of China, Taiwan is kept apart from those organizations, well, it can be disastrous. In late December 2019, Taiwan was warning the World Health Organization that the coronavirus developing in China can be passed between humans. WHO, which was under the pressure of the CCP, ignored this warning and kept repeating what Communist China was saying, that there was no proof for such transmission. If at that point we did hear what Taiwan was saying, if it was heard in the international arena, then perhaps a lot of lives would have been saved, and perhaps our economies would not have suffered so much. I would like us to acknowledge and understand that support for Taiwan is equivalent to strengthening our international system based on law. And just allow me to conclude with something straight from Taiwan. Several days ago, the Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs gave an interview to a Polish newspaper, Rzeczpospolita Daily, and he described what the West can do for Ukraine and what will also be important for the fate of Taiwan. The minister said that the Chinese government is following very closely how the war is progressing. He wants to know if the democracies of the world are going to remain united to defend this country that has been attacked. And if they do, then it will be a very important factor for Xi Jinping, the president of China, so that he is disillusioned that he can deal with Taiwan on his own, that no one would come to help. I think it's an important signal for Xi Jinping. Perhaps he would put off an attack on Taiwan for many years. So that's a very important message. If here and now we want to save our international order, we have to do all we can in order for Putin not to succeed in Ukraine. And this will also be a very clear signal for Xi Jinping that his attack on Taiwan can end in defeat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive correspondence straight from Taiwan. It's a very important voice. I think we've touched upon a number of subjects which, well, each of them would require a separate seminar. I think, in my opinion, the question of public health in Taiwan, including traditions, including shared Taiwanese, Polish, Chinese traditions there, because we have a very interesting Polish thread there. So this voice of Taiwan warning against the spread of coronavirus was very important, but was not coincidental. It follows in line of a very long tradition that Taiwan has there. So the Taiwan calling for acknowledging its role and position in the World Health Organization in view of the threats that we have constantly when it comes to contagious diseases, to pandemias and so on, definitely has very deep justification. And it's not just a single time occurrence, even though it was obviously a very important example that you've called upon. Taiwan is very important to us because It is, in fact, a living democracy and administration which has a lot of experience in analyzing the methods used by the continental China, by the Communist Party of China, in trying to influence the collective West, the so-called free world. So we can learn a lot from Taiwan here, and the necessity to support Taiwan is obvious. And I think that your presence here also plays a role here. We are going to remember your words.
Without much ado, I would like to give the floor to Jack Herndon, who is based in Warsaw within the International Republican Institute, Warsaw office of the International Republican Institute, specializing in Indo-Pacific, and not only expert, the person who actively deals with those issues. Jack, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Really honored to be here. So I understand we're already at time, so I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible so we can get to the Q&A, because I've got a lot of questions myself. But anyhow, so I wanted to focus a little bit more on the beyond. I think we've talked about Hong Kong a lot. We talked about Taiwan. We haven't so much touched on the beyond. I know we've said the big words, the international liberal world order, which is a lot of syllables, but no one really is so sure what it means. But I promise you that it's actually really important, and there's something we have to do about it. I work for the International Republican Institute. It's believe it or not, a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. We are an NGO. And we traditionally, what we do is we work with political parties in the developing world to strengthen the competition for power, which is a fundamentally democratic idea. So why then am I doing countering China work, or why does anything that I have to do with political parties matter when talking about China? Well, I think that the strengthening work that we did on democracies really was effective when we were in an uncontested environment. Now we're in a strategic environment where China is out there, it's in the world, it's trying to change it. And the contested space is developed and developing democracies alike, either by means of political influence, coercion, or manipulation, or information manipulation. So, slow down. Yes, I will slow down. Yeah, of course, I can slow this down. Yeah, so we are in a contested environment where China is in democratic societies trying to shape their behavior. In order to accomplish its objectives, such as the subjugation of Hong Kong or the reunification of Taiwan, without any type of global pushback. So why it does this, for me, there's really two drivers to China's behavior. Number one, the current international liberal world order doesn't provide China with any, or the CCP with any political security. Democratic values are embedded in the international liberal world order. So in order to stave off this potential threat to its legitimacy, it has to change the international liberal world order to gut it of those values or turn them into meaningless things, like human rights. Which human rights, even the definition of human rights as political rights, it is something that is actively redefining in the UN as development rights, collective rights to development. The rights of the individual are erased. So that is one example of how it reshapes the international liberal world order. The other driver is really glory, and I think that actually we don't talk about this very much. The Communist Party is actually not just content with, and slowing down again, is not just content with safety. It actually wants to see communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics being respected around the world as one of the greatest contributions to humanity. That is its goal. So it's both defensive in terms of needing to eliminate the threats, and then offensive in terms of wanting to attain glory. And so the issue with all of this is that unlike in the Cold War, we're not able to kind of retreat to our respective camps and see which system produces what results. This is a single connected environment, and the stakes are higher because we cannot keep our values intact while China pursues its objectives as well. And in order to pursue its objectives, China needs to defang those ideals popularizing its alternative paths to development and modernization, and build a circle of friends or at least neutralize threats in other democracies around the world. So how it does that is essentially what I've been asked to do, and I don't get worried. I've been trying. Let me check the time just to make sure. Okay, I'll keep this a little bit shorter. So China does essentially all of China's influence. The cornerstone of China's influence and the entry point of all influence into other countries is and has always been China's economic influence. China wants to create more dependencies, more trade dependencies, and have robust relationships, trade relationships, because that makes constituencies, pro-Beijing constituencies within other countries. And the problem with that, and that's completely fair, and China is actually has its rights to do that. However, what it does is, and obviously I'm an American, so I'm no stranger to big business having a lot of influence over foreign policy. These communities become more beholden to Beijing's interests than the interests of the country itself. The second is narrative dominance. China wants to dominate the narrative and be the loudest voice to shut down conversations that are critical to the CCP, either by directly threatening to blacklist people in Poland, for example. Thank you, Hannah-Shen, for that really illustrative example, or by expanding the footprint of its organizations around the world, either the China Daily or by dominating the Chinese language diaspora newspapers in order to have influence over diaspora communities around the world, using its social media platforms such as TikTok in order to prioritize news that goes to you that puts China always in a good light. And that's actually documented having happened in Indonesia. This is not just America being paranoid about it, by the way. And last, of course, sharp power, just using its economic power to punish enemies that dare to speak against it. But really, China actually has most of its work done for it in most imperfect democracies or imperfect societies, where it simply has to tap into existing structures of corruption and whatnot in order to get that system to work for it. So it's within China's interest as well, in order to keep those relationships or that hierarchical structures intact, so it, as an extension of its own power, which again kind of ends up propping up these more authoritarian regimes and preventing any kind of democratic movement from consolidating and being able to take hold. And the last is actually something I want to just draw attention to, and I think this is really important just because people don't talk about this enough, is subnational engagement at the city and provincial level between the Chinese Communist Party and other actors in various cities. Actually, this happens in America. It's actually quite hilarious. I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but there was a list of all 50 governors ranked in order of their favorability to Beijing. So they have the intelligence on the officials at the local level in order to see where the entry points can be. And our the Australian ambassador might be able to also tell us a little bit about how the engagement with Victoria. Please, I hope I'm not butchering this. When they signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative agreement, when Canberra had already turned China down on that. In particular. So that's part of this idea of surrounding the city from the countryside, a Maoist idea in terms of being able, in order that China or the CCP can circumvent the national government or any pushback that it has there to build constituencies around the city and eventually get enough or a strong enough voice to have a more influential impact in national governments. So I think with that, those are the four kind of things that I wanted to highlight. In interest of time, I won't go into the other details, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the work that IRI does and what countering this actually means, which is a conversation in its own right.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I kindly ask the ambassador to eventually take the floor, if you wish. Of course, I'm personally very much interested in your story about coercion against Australia, because actually Australia was one of the first so visible and big examples, but also your views on the situation in the region, in Hong Kong in particular, and possibly Taiwan. Please, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. And it's very nice to be up here in Gdansk again. Look, I'll just speak very briefly, and I'll start with reminding everyone that Australia is, of course, an Indo-Pacific country, that we have had a very strong relationship with China and the Chinese people since the early days of Australia. We have an Australian-Chinese community of 1.4 million, which is about 5.5% of our population. Fantastic, dynamic Australians. We are outspoken supporters of the international rules-based order. Very outspoken supporters. We're one of the founder nations of the United Nations. And as a middle power, the system has got to work for us. And like Poland as well, the system has got to work. In terms of Hong Kong, successive Australian governments have expressed concern about the erosion of human rights in Hong Kong, about the impact of the National Security Law 2 years ago, the impact on pro-democracy activists, on trade unions, on civil society. And as I say, we've been very clear about that, and we've conveyed those concerns repeatedly to the Chinese government. Similarly, Australia has also expressed concern about the situation in Xinjiang. Again, we've been very outspoken about that. As you've mentioned, there's been various trade repercussions for Australia arising out of our outspokenness, but we've made it very clear that we need to stand up for our values, and I think that's what you're talking about today, and that those of us who share those values need to continue to work together to assert those values. Now, China is very important to Australia. It's our number one trading partner. Something like 33% of our trade is with China. So we need to have a good relationship with China. At the G20 meeting last week, Prime Minister Albanese had the first face-to-face meeting at leaders level with China in 6 years. He made it very clear to President Xi that we will disagree on things and we will be public about our disagreements, and that is how honest relationships go. Look, I know that this is over time. I'll be happy to talk to others afterwards, but one of the other points that Prime Minister Albanese made to President Xi is to encourage him to use his influence with President Putin to try and stop the aggression and the war in Ukraine. And we've got to recognise as well that there's levers there that can be used. So it's very complex. There's no easy answers to this, and it's an ongoing issue. But the points I've just made, I think it's fair to say they would be right across the Australian political spectrum. There's significant agreement and support in the Australian community for those views, and something that we'll continue to assert and work with partners and friends on, including Poland and members of the European Union. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Chciałam się spytać.
I would like to ask you, who represent the Dignity Association. Would any one of you like to take the floor? You're more than welcome. The president of the association. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the oldest person here. I was born even before World War II, so I am under the protection of the Heritage Protection Officer. Yes, it's just a joke. I saw the Russian Soviet army. I saw the Germans when they invaded us. So I wouldn't want to come back to that, but let me just mention that Poland has survived as a nation, as a state, thanks to the church. That's the truth. When the communists came to Poland in 1945, of course, they started with fighting the church, because that's what they had to do. The church was the strongest organization that was deeply rooted in the society. So they started fighting with the church. Cardinal Wyszyński was imprisoned and other priests were imprisoned and murdered, but we have survived, thanks to the church. But I would like to tell you what it looked like among regular people. I worked in the port since 1960. My China relationship was just that I handled Chinese goods in the port of Gdańsk. We handled tractors, rails, machinery of all sorts for China, and China would send pigs, quartered pigs, rice, cotton, etc., back to us. So that was our relationship with China, us as regular people. My closer encounter with China was in 1989 when I became an MP, and there was a massacre in the Tiananmen Square, the massacre of Chinese students. We know all that from that times, and we saw the face of China, how the way the communists from the Soviet Union were showing us for so many years. So we saw the true face of China. And I would like to say that it's a good thing that you're showing the danger, the threat to Hong Kong and Taiwan. But aren't you concerned that if Russia loses the war, won't China reach for Manchuria? Russia took Manchuria from them. China remembers that. Yes, well, do you remember what happened when Russia threatened to use an atom bomb? China withdrew, but it is still big harm to China. If they manage to succeed in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, they will remember Manchuria. So in this difficult, imbalanced world, we have a struggle between two big ideologies: democracy that is based on Christianity and a system based on communism. And these two worlds are clashing, be it in Russia or in China. It still exists. And we are very much concerned. Well, I don't have to be concerned because I won't be here much longer. But young people have to remember that these two systems are very dangerously clashing, and this is dangerous for humanity. And a word to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Australia. Your Excellency, I would like to thank you on behalf of my colleagues who are sitting here, that our colleagues, after martial law, they found refuge in Australia. A number of my friends live there. MP Płażyński went to Australia recently for a visit. So thank you for giving them refuge and for giving them work and an ability to make a living. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was President Czesław Nowak, President of the Dignity Association. And we have another contribution.
Good afternoon. Fedakowski Stanisław, I'm the secretary of the Association Dignity, Godność. Well, we were imprisoned during the martial law. Czesław, Krzysztof Sosnowski, my colleagues present here, many other people, 158 people in total from the region itself. So, well, referring to what has been said here today, I'd like to point attention to one important issue. There was a question posed, what should we do in view of the pressure from the concept of the so-called badly understood freedom, the kind of limited freedom that is offered. You're saying you are free to choose, right? However, the dilemma is freedom of choice or choice of freedom. Because true freedom is based on choosing freedom, not on freedom of choice. So even if you buy 3/4 of a superstore, and load up commercial goods as much as we can, we will not be free. Only choosing freedom from oppression, from political oppression, from blackmail, from fear, this is freedom. This is the only way to be internally free. And this is the difference that has to be stressed out, that has to be pronounced. And in this way, we can strengthen both ourselves and others, and we can create a front of resistance against ideology. And here we have to also add the supporting of building strategic thinking. We have to learn how to think strategically based on facts, because what we are threatened by today from the side of the new media, of electronics, of electronic media, from the side of these various devices, which in themselves are great, but this new technology actually is used to a completely different purpose these days. We have to understand first and foremost that when we say free media, there is no such thing as free media. There are free or enslaved journalists, enslaved by corruption, by fear, who work there. It's the journalists who make the media free or not. Just the concept of free media does not make the media free. It is the people who work there, the journalists. It's up to them whether the media will be free, in fact. And the same thing happens with the freedom, which is inherent in our decision and what we do. Choosing freedom makes us free. And this is the direction we have to follow. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This was Mr. Fotyga, the secretary of the Dignity Association, former political prisoner and a signatory of Gdańsk Agreement, Solidarity Agreement. I will also have learned that Mrs. Sham would like to add a few words. And we're also open to questions from the room. But first, Mrs. Sham. Please unmute. Please excuse me. Yes, I think I'm heard now. I wanted to refer to this voice we've just heard about the freedom to choose. Chinese think in the same way. A few years ago, Henry Wu, who is no longer alive, who spent in the Camp Laogai 19 years just because he was a Catholic. He spoke about that. He often says that China is portrayed as a country with freedoms already. But he said that today Chinese have a freedom to choose from a number of shampoos, for example, or products or cosmetics, but they have no freedom in saying what they think. So the freedom of commercial freedom is not followed by religious freedom, for example. There is a big gap between the two. So the freedom, the choice of freedom and choosing from something is a big distinction which Chinese are aware of, I think. Now, one more point. Should we be afraid that the Chinese, seeing that Russia will probably lose in Ukraine, will they not go in that direction? Well, I think we are not under that danger because the Chinese need Russia. They want Russia to win in Ukraine in order to be, for example, to go heavy on Taiwan. And the document number 9 issued in 2009, which was supposed to be a secret document only for the Communist Party authorities, but only the Chinese journalist Goi made it public. She spent years in prison for it. The document says clearly what is a threat to the Communist Party regime. And this is declared as Western values. For example, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, Christianity, free media, freedom of voicing an opinion, the rule of law, etc. So this is a threat. So the West is a threat. Our values are a threat to them, not Putin's Russia. I agree that Putin's Russia is not a threat to China, even though the equilibrium between these two actors is a completely different matter. However, I do have pretty bad news for continental China. Russia is not going to win in Ukraine. I was sure of that from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, which the Russian Federation started. I'm sure Ukraine will be victorious. Even this support of collective West is not all that easy because it happens with a lot of resistance, because we were dealing with decades of rather intensive cooperation between the West and Russia. But the West so far remains consolidated against this war, against Russia in support of Ukraine. So I'm also very happy to see the position of Taiwan, how active, how it supports Ukraine, how it shows solidarity with Ukraine in view of this war, how it understands all the cruelty and brutality that Ukrainians have to deal with. Now, we have very little time left, but would anyone from the room perhaps like to ask a question, voice an opinion? I just wanted to say a couple of words of hope. In my opinion, communism has lost already once. Soviet Union broke down, right? So these are historical facts. It's a source of hope. So Russia will lose and democracy will win. That's just a glimmer of hope. Thank you very much for this very essential conclusion of the situation.
I'm afraid our time for this seminar is over. I would like to conclude this meeting thanking our distinguished panelists for their valuable contribution. We had a quite broad audience also connected with us remotely, including many viewers within the European Parliament. We, MEPs, advisors, our assistants remain vigilant. When we speak about coercion, there is work in progress on the European instrument to counter coercion against us. It was triggered by the situation of Lithuania undergoing real pressure, but earlier it happened to Czech Republic as well for a variety of visits of Czech officials to Taiwan. Mrs. Shen mentioned the well-known visit of Speaker of U.S. Congress, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan, and retaliatory measures taken by the PRC, namely the exercises in air waters in Taiwan Strait and else around Taiwan, and preparatory measures in around Taiwan as well. So it is important to monitor situation. It is important to remain united. I would like to present the situation of Hong Kong and very dire situation of democratic society, people who were used to relatively free life there, and that would like to enjoy freedom. I share personally Mr. Bernardin's view that changes within PRC are to trigger also changes and improvement of situation in Hong Kong. As similarly, all of us, or many of us, believe that the victory of Ukraine over Russian Federation and the vicious Putin regime are to trigger changes in broader region, including nations and indigenous people still living and oppressed within the Russian Federation. I kindly invite you, zapraszam wszystkich
At
Państwa.
this point, I'd like to invite all of you to lunch, which will be served right outside the room. So, in conclusion of the seminar, let's eat something and perhaps we can talk in less formal setting. Thank you very much.